I watched Trump addressing the GOP today, so you don't have to, and here's my overview. We'll start with the craziest thing he said, which is that immigrants are animals and not human. All right, he spoke for 90 minutes. He mentioned Biden 9 times, Obama 5 times, Tim Walz once, and Kamala Harris 3 times. There's a lot here, so we're going to have to go fast. He says that he doesn't understand why when a president wins one time, then they lose the midterms. And then he says, I'm smarter than everyone in this room because I became president. And then he says, just kidding. Then he says Democrats are violent and vicious people, but they at least stick together. And then he goes on a long rant about how he has to call people at 3 a.m. And then he says that he loves the people that he doesn't have to call because they just agree with him right away on anything he says. He starts to introduce a person, but then gets distracted and keeps talking about other stuff. But at different points during this introduction, he'll say that it's a nice person, a high quality person, a very fine person, a religious person, a very honest person. And then he eventually tells us that that person is Mike Johnson. He doesn't mention Thomas Massie by name, but he says that there's a Republican who has a sickness because he won't vote for anything and everything that Trump wants him to. Then he's talking about Congressperson Doug LaMalfa, who died yesterday, and says that he oftentimes goes to hospitals where the wives don't even care that their husbands are dead because their husbands left them a fortune and they're just looking for the next gentleman that they can get in bed with. He says if you're a Republican and you have something that you disagree with Donald Trump on, and even if you are 100% correct about it, you're not supposed to bring that up. Don't forget it is the 5th year anniversary of him committing an insurrection, but he says that on January 6th that Nancy Pelosi was offered 10,000 National Guard people, even though he as the president is the only person in charge of the National Guard. And then he said he only found this out when her daughter did a documentary, and then he calls her daughter a documentary-ess. He says when they went to Venezuela to kidnap Maduro that there were a lot of people killed, but they were mostly just Cubans, so it's really not an issue. He says all the protesters against him are paid, and the way that you can tell that, of course, is because their signs are very nice, which is something he said a bunch before. But the new thing he says is now he says he wants to find their sign maker and get them to work for the Republicans. He says no one has as good of weapons as us, and then immediately says, but also we're selling those weapons to anyone who's willing to buy them. And then he says that he's sold more Boeing planes than anyone in history, and Boeing gave him an award for that. He says the guy who was running the auto pen for Biden didn't even know Biden at all, and then he goes on a rant for like 5 minutes about voter ID. Then he says that if you even ask for voter ID in California, they will throw you in jail. And then he goes on and rants about men and women's sports for like 10 minutes, during which he's going to talk about the long distance runner, the weightlifter. And then he's going to say that his wife hates when he imitates the weightlifting, and his wife also hates when he dances. I know you're waiting for a transgender for everyone. I promise you it's coming. He then says he's not sure if he's allowed to run in 2028, just doesn't have a clue. And then he says that people in the Congo make our motorcycle gangs look like little sweethearts, and then says also Trende Aragua are awful people and they're totally taking over the state of Colorado, which I live in, and they're not. And then he says that they're cutting off people's fingers for calling the police. But Governor Polis doesn't want to do anything about it, so he's just not. He says there's no murders in D.C. for the past 7 months. I just looked it up. The Metropolitan Police Department reported 5 murders in D.C. in December alone. Talking about crime in D.C., he says that 90% of the crime in D.C. is committed by 2% of the people there. That's his administration. He is describing his administration with that statement. He talks about that time that everyone thought he was dead and says that all he did was take a day off after speaking for 32 straight days, and that he was playing speed golf, and reiterates multiple times that he plays speed golf. And then he says he likes golf, but he doesn't get to play much. There's a website called Did Trump Golf Today, which keeps track of whether or not he golfed, and he has golfed on 79 of the 352 days he's been in office, which is 22% of the days he's been in office. During that joyous time where we all thought that he could be gone, he says this direct quote, "I don't want to use the D word because it's such a horrible word. Dead." He then talks about drug prices for a long time, and you're going to get in the speed run some of the things that he says. But he says our pills would reduce from $13 to $30, and then he says again our pills are reduced from $13 to $30, and then he catches the mistake that he made, and then he says that they'll reduce from 13, meaning 130, down to $30. He says depending on the way in which you calculate it, that could be a reduction of thousands of percentage point, and says there's 2 ways of calculating it, and one of them would be like 90, 80% off, and the other one would be thousands of percentage points. There are no 2 ways of calculating this. There is one, and the number is 76.9%. He's talking about how people who respect him call him Mr. President and those who don't call him Donald Trump. So, Donald Trump, this whole video is dedicated to you and your awful administration. He also says that Putin and President Xi call him Mr. President. He says that we are the only country that votes by mail. I just did a quick research. Here are other countries that in part or in full allow people to vote by mail. Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Canada, Fiji, France, Germany,